Samuel Fletcher married Harriet Lomas at Wellington on the 26th of February 1866, the day after her 17th birthday. They set off for Hawke's Bay by ship from Port Nicholson, then the port of Wellington, sailed up the coast to Ahuriri, the port of Napier, and from there they journeyed by bullock wagon to the high country of central Hawke's Bay. On arrival here, Sam pointed out to Harriet the great similarity of the hill to Pendle Hill in England, where he'd spent much of his boyhood. So there were no problems about naming the property. No roads, no bridges, and no roof over their heads, and the nearest neighbours were the Maori sub-tribe at Tikitino, and they were here on their own in a great wilderness of dense bush, just the two of them. They slept the first night here together under the wagon on a bed of fern with the tarpaulin as shelter walls. Next day they made a makeshift hut and then set about building the clay house. Just the two of them. And so, as each sod was placed on another, so began Pendle Hill, New Zealand. It's now 137 years later. The clay house is gone, but not forgotten. Pendle Hill Homestead is gone from here, but the main portion is in good use again at Onga. Samuel and Harriet have been physically dead for many years, but their spirit is here in us today with the wonderful gift of faith and togetherness we've inherited from them, and that will live on forever. Thank you.
Only too proud to be part of this occasion, and I think it's really great, and most important that there's a big lot of young children here, and really remember this day, kids, because it's, if you take yourself back, 136 years, and just think what it was like then. Here we stand today. And just while I'm up here, Rona is actually writing a book on Pendle Hill and its people. I think she's going to it, and it should be out. When is it likely to be ready, Rona?
Well, I've made a deadline for October 1994, right. Labour weekend. I hope the weather doesn't do its historic thing.
I'm sure it's going to be an excellent book. Rona's put in a lot of time and work with it, and it's one that, well, I'm certainly going to purchase, and hopefully many of you here today will as well. That's about all I've got to say.
We've talked a lot about your mum, Rona, because she's played a special part in why we're here today and so forth. What can you tell us about her? Where was she born?
She was born in Onga Onga in 1928 and grew up, well, she was of course spent the first 3 years at Retro. Mm-hmm. Then came down and they lived in the village, and grandfather Fletcher worked at the butcher shop, managed that, and interestingly my father-in-law John Buchanan made that possible, and he was also able to carry on shearing while he was working the butcher shop, and Annie, Nana, would look after the shop during those days. And my mother had a wonderful childhood with her elder brother and sister, and then her 2 younger sisters. Very happy, carefree. Yeah. And then they moved and they had a small block along Highway 50, which is now owned by Meredith's. And then she moved, she went to Wellington and actually was going to travel overseas, and then so came home to Onga Onga and worked in the shearing gangs. However, going to England didn't happen as quickly as she'd thought. She went to Napier to work, and she in Wellington had worked for the post office and was a secretary. Mm. And that was where she met my father. So, at the age of 25, my mother married, and of course in those days they all thought she was going to be left on the shelf, really. Yeah. And Dad had a service station in Napier, and Mum carried on working, and then a couple of years later I arrived. And that, of course, was the mid-50s when farming was booming, and Dad decided that, right, that was what he would do because he was surrounded by brothers-in-laws, you know, that were all farming. And he came down to Onga Onga, and they shepherded up Blackburn Road for the Haldanes, and then went to work up Naruru Road for the Gunsons, and it's extraordinary to think that I live at the bottom of Naruru Road now. And I started school at Onga Onga just for the first 6 months.
Okay.
And then Mum and Dad moved to Norsewood, where they had a small block of land, and then decided they needed something bigger and went and moved to a property called Pine Hills at the foothills of the Puketois, which is between Makuri and Pongaroa. And then in 1969, 1970 moved back to Napier, where Dad worked with an auto electrician business. He and two chaps set up business there. And I guess it was possibly in those times that Mum's love of history really developed, and she would help at the museum and in Napier. And then eventually decided that, she would write all the history down. Thankfully, you know, I mistakenly thought that everybody knew all that history, but of course, as we know, it wasn't quite the case.
Your time at Puketoi, have you got memories of of there?
Yes, living.
I mean...
Yeah, we were in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly,
Yes, yeah.
So your school...
Makuri School.
Makuri School, how far away was that from?
5 miles, and we would go to school on the mail lorry.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, wow, gosh, it blew.
It blew,
Yeah, it really blew. In fact, as children, we would at times have to crawl to the mail lorry because we would be blown over completely.
Yeah.
And there is talk of windmills going up along there somewhere, but
That's right,
it hasn't happened.
No.
Just...
It wasn't a good experience, the
No.
Puketoi.
No, it wasn't that fun at all for
I
Mum
mean.
and Dad. But as children, we didn't know any of
No,
that. It was only
no,
until later years,
no.
which was, unfortunate.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So you were born, sorry, when?
in 1955.
No,
in Napier.
1955. And who was the teacher at the older school? Who was the headmaster?
I don't remember who the headmaster was, but my dear old teacher.
Not Peggy Boyce? No.
Yes,
Oh,
Mrs.
it was.
Boyce.
Yeah, it was.
Dear old Peggy Boyce.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So who was the headmaster at that time?
Well, I think Noel Bartle would have been
Well,
there.
that would, yes.
Yeah,
that
he would have been.
Yeah. Makes sense.
He was
Yes, in
there-
that old
yeah,
school.
Yes, he was there when I was there. He
Yes.
was right through my time. And it was a great old school, wasn't it?
Well, yes, although being just 5.5 when I left,
Yes,
don't have
yeah.
very vivid memories, but because you would have been a big senior boy when I was there.
So you're now living at Naruru Road and...
Who would have thought
Yeah.
that would have
Yeah.
happened? I
Complete without-
attended a golf, I think it was the Onga Onga Golf 75th reunion with my mother. I don't know how many games of golf she played, possibly one.
Yeah.
Anyway, she was enjoying catching up with people, and that was where I met Robert.
Oh,
And of
that's
course,
right.
the rest is history.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, my mother introduced us. And of course, Mum was very aware of where Robert lived in the little cottage
Yes.
because Harriet and Samuel Fletcher would overnight there on their way from Pendle into Waipawa.
Yeah.
And, sort of on a spiritual level, you wonder, how I ended up there,
Yeah.
the pull of something.
Great
It's
story.
extraordinary.
Yeah.
I just sort of think it's kind of insignificant, but then that's exactly what we thought about, things in the past, didn't we? That now everybody wants to know
Yeah, that's right.
about.
That's right.
Yeah, interesting. Mum died in 2012, I reckon.
That year of the reunion.
Yes, like 2 days before. Of that reunion, she wasn't there. She was there she'd been buried.
Yeah,
and all the flowers and things were all around, the
Okay,
grave.
so we wouldn't have had it.
No, it
organised?
wasn't, no. No, it wasn't done then, so I don't know.
But I do remember saying something because I had a feel that Rona would be looking down on us, so it was just...
But one funny thing, some woman phoned me, and to this day, I don't remember who she was, some older lady, and she was coming down for the reunion, and I explained to her, look, you know, Rona has died, and she thought, who's Rona? And I sort of thought everyone knew who my mother was. She was some distant, you know, relative you know, that didn't know that offshoot of the family or whatever. It was just the funniest thing after her writing her book and everything. You know, another interesting thing which you may or may not know, I was always led to believe with Harriet's, you know, her grave and the tall plinth or whatever it is, no one is to ever have anything bigger than that.
That's right.
Yeah, the cemetery, interesting.
Yeah. And then she also talks in Road from Retro about having to work in the billiard room.
Oh, was
That's
it?
a job.
Yep.
Just, virtually around here.
Yeah. Yes.
Across the road from the pub.
And then she worked in the store too for a bit, didn't she? But she wasn't very good at that. I always remember her saying in the post office in Wellington, there was a staircase, you know those old staircases that went round like that? Spiral. Yeah. And of course in those days she would wear tight skirts and stiletto heels going up the stairs, and she didn't understand why the blokes were standing down there. She was quite innocent, my mother.
Yes.
In that respect.
Yeah.
And she had the dances at the Onga Hall, and I think she does mention it in her book about the girls that would come. They'd go outside and disappear for a while, and then they'd come back and look very dishevelled. And she just didn't get that. Why would you want to look like that? Funny, such lovely, innocent times. And gee, they were as poor as church mice. Tough, but it didn't seem to make any difference to the, you know, the love and the fun that they had.
No.
Grandfather's family with this house, you know, it was like you were saying, it was an open house to everybody, wasn't it? I always remember wandering over, and I'm sure I've told you this story before, being up at the cemetery with Mum and Dad, and unbeknown to me it was your dad was over at the wool shed, and I wandered over, and I always got the Shaws and the Bakers muddled up. I lived away from, you know, here for quite some time, and so I went up to your dad and I said, so, you know, I would have introduced myself, and I said, so are you a baker? And he said, sure.
Oh, yeah.
So I walked away thinking, sure, he was a baker. I've never forgotten that. Dear old Ian.